you brought up the fact that the prison abolitionist framework struggles in places like South Africa. So what are you kind of arguing to get people onto your side? Like how are you going to convince them? Because the point I brought up the ANC, because I think I read something the other day. It was a very kind of trite comment, but I think it's very powerful. We fail to recognize how powerful the ANC, and to borrow something from Michelle, like the ANC's narrative of what is wrong in South Africa and how to make it right. So if the ANC is on the like send them to jail, lock them up thing, Becky Cele as like the embodiment of that, while it doesn't, when its own kind of a minister beats up a woman or whatever, they do nothing. He's still having parties and blah, blah. But how do you what's the work that has to be done to get people to change, for change to happen around people coming on board with the prison abolitionist framework in a place like South Africa? Because in your article you talk about how the jails in South Africa is essentially just to it's a finishing school and a recruitment for more violent gangs. So what is this work I don't want to make it your job, but that has to be done to get people onto this.
Yeah.
It's a hard argument. You're right. It's a very hard argument to make in South Africa, to tell people prisons are not the answer.
So, an interesting story maybe to start with is that I started writing my dissertation. I picked the topic at sort of the very beginning of the year, end of last year. And at the time, I thought, this isn't something that's going to take off in South Africa anytime soon. It's barely even taken off in the States, which is where so many of the great abolitionist thinkers are based or have been from. And so I sort of thought of myself as this isn't going to be mainstream, but it's something that I think is important and that I'm interested in. And hopefully it's a contribution that I can make to starting that conversation. And then we have what happens to George Floyd, and we have the protests in the US, and there's almost like an explosion of talk about defunding or abolishing the police and prisons. And I was it was wonderful, but it was also so surprising. I think people just really exceeded my expectations. And so, in South Africa recently, so I know there are groups of students that are advocating for abolishing the police and prisons. Is a really cool group called Cops or Flops that does, interesting name, but they do some really cool work, at least around spreading awareness and starting that conversation. But at, I guess, a more social movement space, recently a group of activists in Cape Town, and I mean quite a large group of a coalition of many different groups that work on the ground, released a letter that explicitly demanded the abolition of one of the city of Cape Town's law enforcement units because of the role that law enforcement plays, especially in the city of Cape Town, in evicting the poor. And so this was a demand that came, from the ground, not from someone in an Ivy League tower somewhere at UCT, but from poor people, working class people, homeless people, and activist groups that they have formed and that they work with. So I think that the first point I want to raise is, yes, it is a difficult country to speak about abolition in, considering, the rates of violent crime that we have. But people are surprisingly more open to this than we would think often. And once presented with these ideas, are very eager to engage and often to climb onto that train. And the second thing I want to say then is that as much as we do have a problem with violent crime, we also have a problem with an incredibly inefficient police force, or at least a selectively efficient police force, right? So something I mentioned in my article is that the police are completely unable to deal with rape and sexual assault, but they are very, very efficient at quashing protests and evicting people. And I think that's something that most South Africans know and will intuitively agree with. So I think that's a very good springboard to work off of. And I think it's something that a lot of the mainstream sort of feminist movement now would engage with if presented with those facts and these arguments. The idea that we're calling for the police to be more involved and to be trained better. But here are the facts on how they have consistently failed, and how I think, a slight reframing of abolitionism as not only being about the humanity of perpetrators, but also as being victim centric, as being essentially about how do we ensure that victims have a meaningful form of justice, which is more than just saying your perpetrator maybe in 8.6% of cases will be locked in a cage. So that's, I think, a type of reframing that needs to be done in South Africa, especially. Whereas in the US, you can talk a lot about how a lot of people are convicted on minor drug offenses, and there's a very racial dynamic. In South Africa, while those definitely are present, we do have to reckon with the slightly often more violent nature of harm that is present. But there's a lot of work there. And the last thing I just want to mention that I think is interesting is one of the techniques, because obviously, the obvious techniques are things like mutual aid programs that people are very willing to buy into and that aren't explicitly abolitionist, but can be made to be or slanted that way, things like spreading awareness. I was doing some research for my dissertation, and in Ghana, I think they at some point had this really interesting program where they would open prisons up for members of the public to visit. And you would go and do tours of working prisons. And a lot of what they found there, and I mean, this wasn't massively rolled out, but where it was that people were shocked. They were horrified. Prisons are often invisible to us and hidden from us. And that's one of the reasons why they're spaces of such abuse and human rights violations. But where you can actually invite people or in some way make prisons and prisoners' lives more visible, I think a lot of people would intuitively feel like this is not okay. This is not what we think is happening. And I mean, we all know that Pollsmoor and other prisons in South Africa are atrocious, but it's often just an article you read at some point and you quickly dismiss. And I think awareness around those things could be really, really helpful.